So we have something excited before we get started with our keynotes for the day. So we have a lucky draw by Prodmark where they're giving away two lucky winners who visited their stalls, Amazon Eco, or they're giving them a Kindle. So let's see who the two lucky winners are. So may I please request Mr. Bhavin Bansali, CEO and founder Prodmark and Produce Solutions, and our Vice President, Mr. Vinayak, to please kindly come on the stage. So who's going to take out the lucky one?
So winner is Mr. Vijay Kumar KM, Deputy General Manager, Information Security, Tata Communication. Is he here? Okay. So if he's not here, he will get this gift at stall of Project.
All right, who's the second lucky one? Let's see if he's here around in the hall.
Second winner is Mr. PK Bishwas, General Manager, IT, NHPC Limited. Is he here? Mr. PK Bishwas.
So the first keynote we have is from Trend Micro. We have with us Ankur Patial, Senior Technical Consultant, Cybersecurity, Trend Micro, giving a talk on Taming the Chaos. May I please welcome him on stage, sir?
My name is Ankur, and warm welcome and thank you for joining in this session. And as you all acknowledge that today the threat landscape is increasing like at a very rapid pace, and often in my discussions with CEOs, can you please close these lights? Front lights. Yeah. So generally, often in the discussions with CEOs and CIOs, they always been complaining that the cybersecurity programs always require for increased investment. They have more demands, and again, they're not able to say how much they require. Again, they get a push from their CFOs that the investment what they have done in cybersecurity, is it successful or how we can measure it. So before I jump into my presentation, I just want to highlight few findings from the SOC survey done by, and in this SOC survey it was found that people understanding that the threat landscape is changing, they have invested in products. And again, we talk about the effectiveness of those products, it is not there, because product has been bought, but they're still working as a silo. They're not able to integrate with the customer's existing portfolio. Second thing which was very highly highlighted, that the lack of skill set. So people have the technology, but again, to manage these advanced technologies, new tools which are required for cyber security, you require trained people. And third thing which was highlighted, that the NOC and SOC relationship. So people have built their NOCs, people have built their SOCs, but again, when we talk about SOCs, they are not automated. They're still working as a simple SOC. Again, we talk about the relationship between the two teams, NOC and SOC, it's not there. Again, there are manual efforts, and what we see today, that to protect an attack, the time to detect and time to protect need to be shortened. And when these two teams are not working together, again it has been increasing. So again, to my presentation, this is the view what a pilot sees when he is flying the aeroplane, and at night there are lights, and when he sees that the horizon is just the state, but it's a false horizon. And normally we see the pilots, they get confused or they met with an accident because the actual horizon is little vertical. Same is the thing what we see in our networks. So customer says that we have invested in technologies, we have the all blacklisting technologies, we can block the bad guys. People say we have put the compensatory controls, and we have whitelisting technologies. So again, we are good. And they said there is a little bit of gray And we need not to worry about it. They say that the people in China and Korea, they are more after Mr. President, why they have been interested in my network. But if we look at the realities, the blacklisting technologies are not working. We see more than 1,000 zero-day malwares. We see rapid increase in 0 days. We talk about our whitelisting technologies. Again, attackers have found ways to compromise these whitelisting technologies also. People say, I have the good at, but what we see in the recent past, we see like business process compromise, we see supply chain compromise. Again, a good example, last year we had that computers like which comes to Amazon and go to Department of Defense. So the bad guys have compromised the motherboards. They have planted a chip into it and they made a way to the customer's network. Again, when we talk about BEC, it is again on a rapid fire. We see lot of business email compromises happening, and generally the CIO and the CEOs, they says that the CFO is the only guy who don't know, he's not a technical guy, and he clicks on phishing links and gives up his passwords. When we look at the small chunk of gray area, again what we see that the average cost to protect a breach is like around $4 million now. Again, what we see, the time to protect is going high, and most of the times when customer get compromised, they've been notified by the third party agencies that you are got compromised. So what next to do? So some statistics what I have picked up, that if you see, it's very specific to Asian countries. So time to identify a breach is around 184 days, which is very highest in the world, and the mean time to contain is 65 days. And what we see, this graph is broadening, it's not getting short. So the more time we take to identify a breach, more is the investment or more is the cost which is involved in it. Again, looking at the landscape, it's more chaos now. So what we see, as we see in the last slides, that attackers have innovating themselves, they're finding means and ways to get into your enterprise network. Again, on the same side, customer also want to innovate, and they've been adopting new technologies. Like we see people are moving to cloud, they are adopting technologies like Dockers, agentless, serverless technologies. Again, we see a big shift which is happening our business models. So we see after demonetization, there's a huge shift in our banking applications. People are moving to digitizations, like apps like Paytm and other things they have picked up very fast. Again, what customers want as they move to cloud, they invest in their business, they always want to be agile. They always want to continue their business. But again, they get a good press from the revolutionary compliance or the compensatory controls which are being enforced. So recently, we say last year that it was GDPR which was enforced, and coming we have some talks that there is a data protection rule which will also come for India. So if I go and read the CIO's mind, so CISOs are like under very high pressure, so they have to do a lot of things. Today when we talk about, they have the vendor consolidation they have to do shadow IT, they are looking into the skill set because they have invested in technologies and the technologies are not very effective. And again, what we see in the industry, there is a big shift happening when we talk about our data centers. They are no more the traditional data centers, they are more hybrid now. So earlier we had a physical servers, people are moving to virtual, and now we see a big shift happening which is on the cloud infrastructure. Initially what people started, they started with AWS, they went to AWS, but again we see the acquisition and people moving to Azure and Google is big. And again on the serverless technologies and Dockers, we see a good adoption. So might be you not be using today, but if we look at the stats of the world, so in 2016 it was 53% acquisition which happened for Dockers, and for 2017 it was 67%. As we incorporate these new technologies into our infrastructure, they have their own challenges. So now you have micro segmentation and you have a micro application which runs in a Docker, and there is a vulnerability which is discovered in a Docker. As we see last year there was a news that one of the bad guy has planted a Docker image on Docker Hub, and there were more than 1 million downloads, and there was a backdoor in that Docker application, and all major enterprise customers were using it. So how to take care of it? So what we see now, again, people are adopting DevOps environment. So if we see on the face of developer, he always says that I am the one who do all the thing, I have to do the coding, I have to check the code, I have to rewrite it, and he feels that the operation guy is just the guy who push the application, break it, give it to the end user and come back to me and say that we make a fix for it or make a new patch for it. But if we go and look on the ops guy side, he says that developer is the only guy who writes the code and give it to us, and we are the guy who always in trouble. The codes have issues, they have vulnerabilities, they have bugs, and we are the one who have to run on the road and we have to fix it. So what we see, these guys are combining, so people are adopting security, SecOps, and what we see the state of IT guys now. So just imagine like you are driving on a highway at a speed of 120. So business demands that you cannot stop. You should always be working. You can't take your service down. And if you have a flat tire, they wanted you to fix it while you are running, you are in business. So just a thought on you, like, are you ready for it, or you have the tools in-house to take care of these issues? We say not possible. What we see, things can be done if the right tools have been integrated in your network. So what we say, it's not a silver bullet that you go and buy and put it into your network. It's a continuous process. You have to keep on doing it. And what we see in the industry, people have acquired technology which are block and prevent. So like from years we've been doing like buying firewalls, IPS, web gateways, which are the block technologies. But block technologies are no more effective. What we see that more than 1,000 vulnerabilities are being targeted, which are all 0 days. So we see approach need to be changed. We have to work on it. And we also need to see that if something grays come to our network, we should be able to detect it and take remedial action on it. So moving to next slide. So this is architecture being published by Gartner, like how do we need to take care of it. Again, Gartner says the first thing what we need to do in our network is the prevent. If something which is not good, we need to prevent it. But on the same side, we should also have the tools. If something gray comes to my network, my tools should be able to detect what gray is. And once I detect what gray is, I should be able to take action and remediate it, change my policies. So once customers go and reach that maturity of discover and remediation, we see the next level what customer want to achieve is the prediction. So there was something which infiltrated into network, and now you're able to detect, now how do we can predict? How we can do root cause analysis? If that gray came to my network, what all areas it has done? What was my risk exposure? And based on those findings, I should be able to predict and do my protection. That was the guy who came to my network, this is the community, next time this would be the step he can do. And so what I do, I start predicting that this could be something that can target my network. So this is a continuous process, we do not stop. So whenever you see something bad which comes to your network, you discover it, again you take actions on it, and again you predict what would be the next, and you automate this security cycle. We see again some tools are required to and when we talk about the endpoint security, it's on the top of the apex. So I believe you must have acquired a couple of technologies like we talk about virtual patching, memory protection, sandboxing, machine learning. These are tools which are required. So what we see in the industry, whenever you acquire a tool, you have to focus that these are the 4 areas what I have been investing in. So what tool I acquire for prevent, what are the tools I am acquiring for detect, and what are the tools which I acquire for respond, and down the line I need to predict what can happen to my network or who can target me. You need to predict also what tool you acquire. But again you have to keep a notice, like whenever you acquire these tools should not work in silo, which is the biggest problem what we see. These tools should be able to talk to each other and share their finding, and they can automatically work, share findings with each other, and it should be automated. So what we see in the industry, people have already invested in detect and block. So now we have to go to the next phase, which is detect and respond. So blacklisting technology, blocking technology is already there in network, and these are the key tools what we see which help customers to get into this phase in which they can move to the next level of maturity in security. So breach detection systems, these are the appliances which comes, you can put it in your network, they can spin the traffic, they can look into the traffic, not only the east to west traffic, but north to south also. If there's something which is moving inside your virtual machine, that can also detect. They're just like a sensors and give the complete visibility what is happening inside in the network. EDR, MDR, I'll just cover in my next slides. So as we see, endpoint is always the sitting on the apex and has the complete visibility to the traffic what we have. And we see that endpoint has evolved much fast. 4 or 5 years back when we talk to customers, we just say that endpoint is going to die, but we see that endpoint has again revived with the new technology which is EDR. Now EDR has a capability that can do the forensics, it can do threat hunting, but if you talk about the flip side, you require a skilled guy to work on it. You require a good amount of time to do investigation. So I say EDR is good to buy, but again what we have seen, there are new vendors who came in the industry that we say we are the EDR vendors, we work signatureless, but down the line what we have seen that again these EDR vendors have started acquiring signature based technology. You only do detect and you don't remediate, again you are not the choice of the customer, you are not able to complete the cycle of protection. So what we see, EDR vendors are again moving to the traditional approach, and what we see, these two EPP and EDR are overlapping to each other. So we always say to customers, when you look for an approach for an EDR, always check what EDR solutions you have, and we see that all EDR vendors have evolved. They have the technologies like machine learning, behavior monitoring built into it. Are they able to address it or not? And make a cautious choice whether the new EDR functionality is the right choice for you, or you can scale up your existing EPP vendor and do the protection. Addressing the challenges of advanced threat, what we see that when we put these EDR, network forensics tool, threat hunting tools, it gives lots of logs to us. And as we see in the SANS Lab survey also, that the lack of skill set is there. It's very complex. It's not the same guy who was working in a system as server monitoring guy becomes the SOC head, he would be able to discover it. You require the right skill to manage this product. So we say to the customer, when you go for a MDR approach, you need to be a little cautious. It should not be a product centric or a region specific that my MDR only do for endpoint. It should be able to give a holistic view to your organization. It should be able to see your endpoints. It should be able to see your network. If you have your workloads on AWS cloud, Azure cloud, wherever they are, should be able to see IoT device and give you the protection. So some IDC prediction. So IDC says by 2020 people would be shortlisting vendors on the below criteria. And first thing is the consolidation. So they always wanted that they need not to go with multiple products. What we see today, customers on endpoint, they have a blacklisting technology, they have a whitelisting technology, they have application control, they have a virtual patching, they have EDR, they have MDR, and managing this solution is tough. So they always look for a vendor like who can give you the consolidated agent, or a same thing can be provided by the same vendor. Second thing, what we say that the automation, the products that you acquire should be able to integrate with your infrastructure. They have open APIs that they can integrate with your SOC, NOC, and should be a bidirectional integration. They should support STIX, taxi, RESTful API that sitting on a console, SOC team can take actions on it. And third thing, visibility. The dashboards what people give is very static dashboards which are not able to take any action. It should be an actionable dashboards. So moving to the second last slide. So again we say whenever you acquire technologies, because to handle this new advanced threats you have to invest in technologies. There are a couple of technologies there. Always make a cautious buy that you are preventing. What are the technologies which are required to prevent, detect, respond and predict. You should fill those quadrant, buy product accordingly, and should be in an automated fashion that you should be able to share information with each other. So what 5 things you should demand your vendor? First thing, that the product they've been offering, it should not be a silo product. It should have multiple threat protection capabilities, should have the capability to handle the advanced threats like machine learning, behavior monitoring, AI, those things should be in that vendor. Second thing, should have an open API that the product can integrate with your SOC, NOC, and you want to do some customization, pull data from it or send data to someone else, it should have the flexibility to you. Should support modern architecture. Today you are on a physical, you want to move to virtual, you want to go to AWS, Azure, should be able to give you the flexibility wherever you can take your servers and do it. Should have adaptive security policies. So if again I move my workload to AWS, should automatically adapt the policies over there, or I move to Docker, should have protection to Docker. And finally, should give complete access to your data and should not violate your legal compliances. So I believe this is not difficult. If we want, if we have the right tools, we can do it. And let's do this. So we have a booth outside, and I'm available there. If you have any question, you can come down to me. And in Trend Micro, we help our customers with the hybrid security, moving their assets to AWS, Azure. And we have the solutions which are like the next level of EDR and MDRs. If you need any details, you can come down, we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ankur. So let's begin with our second keynote. So we have Mr. Richard Mosley, Senior VP International Sales from Rapid7. I welcome you, sir. He'll be talking on understanding global risk exposure to define your SecOps practice. Over to you, sir.
Richard Mosley. Can you hear this? You can now. What is it? I need to stand over here. Perhaps get another one. Do you still have yours? Hello? Thanks. Okay. Does this work? Are we good? Let's move forward. Can you go forward to the first slide? Okay, before we get started, so my name is Richard Mosley from Rapid7. As you can probably tell, I'm English by my accent, but a great opportunity to be here in India with you here today, not least for the fact that I love coming here, great country. We've got some great things to talk about India as a nation here today. It's also quite difficult being British these days, particularly with what's going on at home with Brexit. So it was a great opportunity to be here today. So let's talk about Rapid7 as an organization. And really the focus of today is to look at threat exposure across the world, look at the different countries and relative values and what we can do about it. And really we start with a basic premise, and that premise is that as society, we deploy technology faster than we can maintain it, we can manage it, and we can secure it. And the reality is that's true here in India, particularly with the speed that India has innovated with technology over the past years. And like many other tech generations, it is creating more apps, more technology. It's dealing with all of the new aspects of cloud and IoT, mobile, etc. Never before has such a volume of technology had to be created so quickly. And yet with it come all of the challenges. So let's have a look. Thank you. Have a look at the approach that we take at Rapid7. Rapid7 is very much a research-based organization. As a software vendor, research has been at the heart of the company since our beginning. Some of you may be familiar with some of the research on the left-hand side there. We do a lot of work with the community. We have the Metasploit community with our Metasploit penetration and attack tool, the world's #1 penetration attack tool. With that, we get a tremendous amount of insight of what's happening through feedback from the community, etc. And we make that available you see in the report just beneath it. In fact, the last threat report became available last week, Q3 Global Threat Report. Gives some good insights and understanding of what's happening there in terms of attacker behavior. If you want to get a copy, it's all free for everybody. Just go to rapid7.com and pick that up. On the right-hand side, we have a team of security researchers who consistently look at new technologies, existing OEM technology, new services, new software, and check those for modern-day vulnerabilities. And then we publish those and make them available with the vendor to ensure that their customers, our mutual customers, all of us here in the room, have a more secure environment. And again, we make that public. But today's talk is really around the central two, so long-term projects that we've been doing for many years On the left, we have Heisenberg project. It's a global honeypot series, or honey nets, up in the world's top 10 cloud providers, looking and trying to understand what is happening at the global level of a threat attack. And with Sonar, which has been a long, multi-year project, where we're scanning the internet to understand what is out there, what constitutes it, and therefore where the risks are. So we put together, this is the third year that we've been doing this, what we call the National Exposure Index. And it's an index or a rating, an understanding of how exposed each country is relative to the other countries. And we look at every country in the world, 187 nations that we've identified as sovereign nations or countries. And they all ranked from 1 to 187. And those in here in orange are the most vulnerable, the most insecure. It's not surprising to see that many of those in orange are the biggest type of companies, those that are most technology forward, those that have a big deployment of technology, etc. And if we look at them in turn, in the Americas, they are the US, Canada, and Mexico. In Europe, they're the UK, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. And out here in Asia, it's China, Japan, and South Korea. And those top 10 of the 187, represent about 65%, or about 100 million servers out there that are addressable on the global internet. So how do we actually do it? How do we collect all of this information? So with Sonar and Heisenberg, we have been scanning, low-level scanning, historically for years now. And we do it almost every day. You can imagine it creates an enormous amount of data. But we do this in conjunction with partners and customers and educational institutions, universities, to boil it down and understand it as it relates to each country and the relative merits of the exploits that are appropriate for each of those. We look at them as we scan. We then geotag them with an SSL geotag. So we actually know when we find an asset where it actually lives, and then we map that back. And hence you can see here, if we go on to the next one, we try and boil it down to make it simple, just put it into 3 areas of exposure here. Exposure to exploitation. To what extent are the assets and the services that are out there exploitable? How much of it can be monitored, as it were? How much of it is easy to see? How much of it isn't encrypted? How much clear text stuff is there out there that the bad guys and the hackers can perhaps monitor over a period of time? And lastly, how much exposure is there to amplification? With modern-day DDoS on the rise, what kind of technologies are enabling amplification through DDoS, etc.? So what we found globally, seen exploitation, at the top there, Mirai at the top there, just 2 years ago, 2016, the Mirai botnet caused an awful lot of havoc, and yet, and leveraged the whole telnet, etc. There's still 5.8 million servers out there running telnet. Again, sort of vulnerable perhaps for the next level of attack. Similarly, post-WannaCry last year, still an awful lot, some 3.5 million addressable servers there that have Eternal Blue or WannaCry exploit capability. Something perhaps more significant than people can be aware of. But most significantly, the sheer number of databases and database services that are out there. As we know, databases were never really designed initially for the kind of modern-day attack methods that people can directly do on the internet. The password capability, the brute forcing capability, they weren't necessarily designed for that. So 13 million databases at risk, and clearly as a vector for the next potential global threat. What could be up here next time, the next WannaCry, the next Mirai type of opportunity that leverages those. On the monitoring side, still an awful lot of unencrypted. File transfer is a great example of a technology that's moved on significantly in the last years. There's lots of low-cost or no-cost encrypted file transfer capabilities, and yet there are 21 million servers out there still with that. Gives hackers, the bad guys, an opportunity to see what you're transmitting. And clearly with email, with POP and IMAP servers, some 7 million servers out there, again, giving the opportunity for people to see. Lastly, with regard to amplification, fortunately, most of the Memcache made its debut at the beginning of this year, January 2018, with the DDoS attack on, record-breaking DDoS attack on GitHub. Fortunately, since then, many of those have gone down really quite significantly. It's great to see that actually, as nations take care of something that, when it hits hard, can be done. But there's still a number out there, sitting at the bottom. So, what about India? How does India rate? So of the 187 countries in total, we talked about the top 10. It's not in the top 10, fortunately, but it is number 17. It was 18 last year, so it's actually got kind of one position worse, one position more vulnerable. But still, for a nation of this size, with the sheer volume of people, the scale, the leverage of technology, the GDP, and all of the other great technology advances that you've made, it's actually a pretty good position when you compare it to those that are more vulnerable. At the top one around encryption, it's a kind of respectable level, 69%. It's grown, it's got more encrypted. You have got it more encrypted over the last year or so. But if you look at many of the leading nations, they're more in the sort of 75% plus of all traffic is encrypted. So some way to go there. The middle one, port 445 is clearly, probably not a good business reason for anyone to be exposing port 445 in terms of its vulnerability. So certainly some big reduction there. And certainly after WannaCry, et cetera. India was the third most affected country globally to be affected by WannaCry. Significant disruption to this nation and many others. Back at home for me as a British person, it was pretty significant. Some of our big institutions, the National Health Service, et cetera, it was crippling. So we clearly don't want that again. And lastly, very significant decrease on SMB at the bottom. Interestingly, big reduction here, and yet other countries such as Australia and the US actually went the other way. So clearly putting themselves at risk there. So in terms of the findings for India, if we look at the individual areas, top one, not too surprising, an awful lot, almost 100,000 databases. Half of all of those were MySQL. Again, it's a big risk exposure for a nation. So in an area perhaps, as a country, one of the greatest perhaps improvements could be made in this area. The encryption we talked about, 69%, still an awful lot really of clear text email servers going on there. Down at the bottom, almost all of the Memcache stuff is gone. But at the bottom here, what we're finding, and we find this in our security reviews, in our engagements with customers, some are still being caught out with the technology deployed in VoIP-type solutions. So prolific now for so many organizations, not necessarily realizing that can be a threat. So why is it? Why, when you think about all these numbers, and you think about the scale of vulnerability, and you think about the extent that the next global exploit could have on each nation, why all of us, in India and the UK and the Americas, everywhere in the world, are we relatively poor at managing these changes and securing as nations? Clearly, there's a lot of change going on, particularly in this country, right? It appears when you look at it like this photo that everything's static, but clearly everything's moving, everything's in motion. And there's a lot going on below the waterline. We also know that here is a great example of a country where on the left-hand side, everything's going up, right? The sheer volume of endpoints, the sheer volume of mobiles, the move to the cloud, the development of applications, the deployment of those apps, a tremendous amount of activity. So a huge amount of change is going on. And yet at the same time, on the right-hand side, we all know about the challenges that we have with resources. We've never got quite enough people, never got quite the time and attention to be able to deal with it. So it's a tough challenge. So when we think about that transformation, we think about where we were in terms of how we used to manage the network, how we thought about security. We've got this whole yesterday's environment moving to a digital transformation, everything being digitized, organizations moving through that journey of becoming, hopefully, on their security journey, becoming more mature, and an awful lot of pain, an awful lot of change undertaken. So at Rapid7, we see one of the ways to do this is using, for example, our research, using our understanding, helping bring together these three areas. When we talk about SecOps, we talk about security bridging the gap between IT and DevOps. Historically, they've been so separated. For those of you, I'm 52. For some of you are almost as old as me. I was, as a young person in the UK, grew up in IT, and back in the very early days of IT was totally separated. There was a lack of automation, big silos, etc. And we've seen over time how IT has come together in a much more fluent way. Now is the time for security to do that, right? The bridging the gaps between IT and security and DevOps is finally here with the kind of technologies, the approach, the mindset, and perhaps the will for the first time to be able to do that. And we at Rapid7 are at the forefront of this in terms of enabling that jump. So when we think about it, we really like to do it through providing a level of visibility at the top line. So as guardians of security, guardians of the organization, to be able to provide that level of visibility without the need for extra people. And doing that through analytics and automation. We heard in the last speech how important automation is as we move forward. And that's a big focus area for us. As a company, we won't talk about the products today, but as a company, we have a raft of technology that helps on a singular platform, singular API, all the great 5 things that we heard about, all the modern thinking, modern generation platform, the single ability to collect at mass scale data so that we can use that. We can create the visibility and understanding, whether we're looking at vulnerability at the management, vulnerability on the network of your applications, looking at incident detection and response. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but Gartner produced their new IDR and SIM Magic Quadrant yesterday. Rapid7 sits very nicely as a leader in there, as a visionary. And lastly, in this whole area of automation and orchestration, security automation orchestration, or SOAR as it's called, and again, as a global leader in that space, we've been very surprised and really pleased with the uptake of automation and orchestration. The sheer level of companies who have so many manual processes, have so many manual operations, which is, as we know, it's tedious, it's time-consuming, and it makes the job dull and somewhat boring. If we can automate some of that, some of it has interaction as it goes, but automate some of those more mundane tasks, we can speed up the process, make it more secure, and actually bring these groups together. So how do we feel when we write these reports? We try to give recommendations, general recommendations. And by the way, this report is a 60-page report. If you go to, there's a link at the end, rapid7.com/research. You can download that report. It's a PDF and read it. You can read there's a 1-page spec for India itself about some of the recommendations. If you'd like to get more involved, we make this data freely available. If you want to get really involved or you're a member of a government or an education institution, we share whole sets of data so that we can work collaboratively on it to make it more useful for others. So what are the recommendations? So this is at a national level, right, rather than at the corporate level. Firstly, that your ISPs and the larger internet organizations should really try and block some of the core risk areas here. SMB, database, and telnet. There really is perhaps, it would make a significant reduction to the exposure of this country if that could be achieved. Secondly, some education necessary about encryption, about getting rid of those POP and IMAP servers, getting rid of FTP, getting rid of all that clear text stuff so that the bad guys can't snoop on what you're doing, what you're sending, etc. And then lastly, the whole UDP place. Replace those older technologies with something new, some of the modern TCP-based variants that just enable the nation to become inherently more secure. That's that. What about at a corporate level? At the top, as we saw in some of the earlier findings, access to port 445, creating an environment that could be exploitable, creating an environment that could lead to the next WannaCry or the next whatever it might be, could be greatly reduced if work was done, good hygiene to reduce that. And secondly, for databases, as we saw, there are an awful lot, 100,000 databases out there, many of which are MySQL, many of them which are breakable. The hackers don't find it that hard to penetrate some of these. If we could reduce that, that would make a significant difference. And then lastly, this whole thing, coming back to the beginning, we talked about how change is inevitable and the fact that when all nations are deploying stuff too quickly without making it and managing it as securely as they can. What if we found a way forward to do this? If we could break down those silos between IT, security, and DevOps with the use of technology, facilitate that with Rapid7 research, Rapid7 technology, the platforms, the offerings that we have. It would really break down that and actually allow India to move forward and innovate more securely. So with that, I think that is the last slide. There's a bit more here at the rapid7.com. We also, on the other side, have a booth. We've got some of the India team here today. If anyone wants to reach out to me, Richard Mosley, on LinkedIn or otherwise, I'd be happy to discuss with you. And if you want access to any more of this security or any further discussions, please do come and see us. But thank you very much, all of you. It's been a great opportunity here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I now invite Mr. Rohan Parak, Senior Sales Engineer and Team Lead, Imperva India, for our next keynote on detecting data breaches fast and accurate. May I please request your presence on stage, sir? Just a moment, he's just setting up his PPT.
Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rohan Parak. I take care of sales engineering for Imperva in India. I know it's a post-lunch session, so I'll excuse you if there is a momentary yawn, but you have to excuse me as well if there is a momentary burp on this mic. So we are going to talk about data security today, and is it still relevant, right? It's a lot of relevant, and I like to present this slide a lot of times. This is what World Economic Forum has to say about the global risks in the year 2018. And when we talk about global risk, it's any risk related to human. And if you look there, highlighted cyber attacks and the data fraud and theft are right there on the top, both in terms of the impact as well as the likelihood. So essentially, there's a fair chance that the probability that the next breach will happen in your organization, the probability of that is much more than having a next 2611. So the data security is important, especially in the times when we are talking about privacy. The data is the goal, right? And it's the most important talk. Probably still there's a utopian dream that we are still struggling to achieve, right? And for any security operations center, what would be that utopian dream? Essentially, for SOC, able to identify and know at all times who is accessing the data. Is that access okay or not, or authorized or not? And if it is not okay, how quickly you can respond to the situation. This is essentially what we all want to achieve. So we talk about indicators of compromise, right? But then there is also something called as indicators of data theft, and these are some of those indicators. Let's stick our conversation today to the largest or the most important data stores that any organization would have, typically a database platform or a file share, right? And these are some of the database indicators of data abuse. Essentially, this is what you are looking to find out in your SOC environment. The expectation essentially is detect data breaches, data abuse, privilege abuse, people who have privileged access to the data, are they abusing those access, any kind of unauthorized vendor or developer activity, and all that has to be zero touch because there's less visibility in terms of, or capability in terms of people doing that task, and we'll discuss that again about in a minute. Whereas the reality is that there are terabytes of audit logs that are there in your environment. A lot of generic alerts, most of them are false positive most likely. There's a lot of guesswork that we do, probably intelligent guesses, but still it's a guesswork in terms of what is right, what is wrong, what is anomalous, what is not anomalous. And of course, there is very, very heavy dependency on the database administrators, application owners, which eventually leads to delay in finding out, detecting a breach, and eventually, you are not able to solve the purpose. This is a classic example, and I would like to emphasize on this particular slide. There's a database which holds PII data. And we have a layer of abstraction in front of database, which we all call as an application, right? There is on a need-to-know basis, we provide people access to the data which is there in the database through the means of that application. That's how it should be happening. But then there are users in your environment, administrators, privileged users who have unconditional, complete access to the database, right? And there are risks associated, right? First, the whole concept of need-to-know basis goes for a toss here because the application is completely bypassed. However, they have to do it, they need those access for operational availability and tasks, but still they have that access. So there's a risk that the whole concept of need to go goes for a toss. Now these eventually are the users who get targeted also. If I have to go and take some data from an organization, probably I would go on LinkedIn and search who is the database administrator in that organization. And then I'll go and do a spear phishing attack on that particular DBA maybe, right? There's a big chance that those users might be careless as well, right? Probably taking copy of the database and putting it in an environment which is not as secure, or even putting it in a public cloud environment in some cases. And eventually, something we don't talk about a lot, but there could be a possibility of that those users may have a malicious intent as well to take the data out. So traditional approach is you have users, you have privileged users, you manage those users. But how do you manage a privileged user, right? There is a reason that user is a privileged. They have to do their job. So how do you manage that? You do monitoring, you do auditing. So that's where tons of logs, alerts come to your SOC every day, right? You're monitoring everything that they are doing. Probably restricting it to having some focus on it, but it's a lot of information that is coming to your SOC. And unfortunately, we don't have database security experts in our SOC. If you go to LinkedIn today and search for database and security as a skill, you will find very, very few people who can do that. And those people are definitely not sitting in our SOC. So somebody has to look into those logs, somebody has to analyze those logs, which is another big task. How do you analyze those logs? How do you identify what is right and what is wrong? And eventually report that as an incident. A traditional approach, which what we have seen has not resulted in a lot of outcomes. This is a classic example. This is how an audit log of a typical database platform will look like. Can you make any sense out of it? I mean, probably if you are a DBA or you have worked on databases, you can understand that there was some select command run, but on what database, what table, was it important or not? It doesn't make any sense. So it's almost impossible to identify an abnormal activity, an anomalous activity in the system. There are various ways, some of those ways we enable our customers wherein the information of the auditing or the consumption of the audit data can be done in a much more easier way. So essentially in a much more structured way, as you can see here, we can tell you who accessed the data, how they did that, where they did that, and what time, and what was the actual activity that they did. But the problem remains, who's going to review? After all, it's just the same amount of data, probably more beautiful, more reportable, more consumable, but still the question remains unanswered of who is going to review this information. Now, another approach is why don't we have a lot of data, why don't we create some rule sets, right? So we identify that this is something bad, let's create a rule set. But typically a policy, when you create a policy in any system, it requires anticipation. You anticipate certain threat, you perceive certain threat, and that this is coming up, and then you say, okay, this is what is bad behavior, this is what should be blacklisted, and then you create a rule out of it. This is a classic example of from our database security systems. This is a very simple rule I can go and create, saying that if anybody is doing a select command on a database which has PCI related information, cardholder information, and the number of records that are retrieved is more than 10, it should be blocked or alerted at least. That's very easy, you can do it very easily. But then the problem here is you have to anticipate this scenario. You have to know that 10 is a number which should not be exceeded. But it will always vary. It will vary with the users, the tables, with the kind of database. Same is the case for files. I can go and write a rule that if somebody is copying 10 files from my file servers, raise an alert. But then is the 10 a good value? Most of the time it's an intelligent guess. Probably in some context based on our experiences, but most of the time the focus eventually for a SOC becomes to reduce the amount of alerts. So when we put the thresholds here, the focus is on minimizing the number of alerts, leaving a lot of gaps open for us. At the same time, we are completely leaving out the unanticipated scenarios, the careless, compromised, or the malicious users in your environment, where you don't know how they are going to access the privileged users in their environment. And by the way, breaches don't happen over a single SQL query or a single file copy. This is the data from the Verizon data breach report from 2017. Almost all of the breaches, the biggest breaches that happened, it took months and years for those breaches to happen. So it doesn't happen over a single query. So even if I had that particular policy in place, it would not be enough for me to go and detect. The side effect is always that there are tons of false positives that keep on coming in from that system as well. Okay. Can you change the slide, please? Okay. So what is the solution? Many of you know we have been doing this database auditing, monitoring for a very long time, but some 3 years back, we ventured into this initiative of solving this particular problem for our customers. We had a lot of data from our customers. There were a lot of tons of audit data that was getting generated. And we had one very specific technology advancement that nobody talks about in the world, which is called as machine learning, right? So obviously, machine learning was taking it leaps into the cybersecurity space. It was becoming mainstream. People were more educated. There were a lot of technical resources, skilled resources you had in the development teams to leverage machine learning into different environments, right? That was the time a lot of tools came in and all, and then we did some research with the data that we had. So the solution that comes out of it is we have data. We have to baseline the behavior of how are people accessing the data, what kind of data, detect anomaly and generate incidents out of that. Very simple, right? You have a lot of data, throw it into a k-means clustering algorithm platform, and then it will generate incident for you. Actually, it doesn't work that way. Why? Because there would be a lack of domain expertise. There would be a lack of domain expertise. A lot of times the question comes to me is, what is domain expertise? Let's jump into domain expertise. So when we talk about baselining, we are trying to identify who is connecting to database, how are they connecting to database, what kind of data they are accessing, how do the peers of those particular users, in their peer group people access the database, how much data they query, and what is the usual working time that they have. The other important thing that we do is classification, which is very important in our context. We do user classification, whether the user who is connecting to the database, is it an interactive user, is it a human, or is it an application account or a service account. We also do the classification of the database, whether the data that is being accessed, is it just a system table or metadata, or is it actually a sensitive data that is there in the database. And also the kind of operations they are doing, is it an OLTP kind of transaction, or it is just a data warehousing query that has been run on that environment, right? Once we do that, we are in a much better position to take more inputs out of that data and come to some certain conclusions. Now again, going back to the domain expertise, where does that come into picture, right? It's very difficult to explain what does the machine learning algorithms are doing underneath. But the kind of domain expertise that we are trying to add there, this is what we want to explain here. You know, things like volume and rate of activity. So when we do actor classification, differentiate between a human user and service account, we look at the volume and the rate of activity, concurrent connections, what kind of operations that they are doing. Are they doing DML, DDL? How are the peers behaving? What is the duration of the connection? Those are the factors that allow us to differentiate and tell us whether this particular query is coming from an application, a service account, or whether it is coming from a human, right? And this involves a lot of domain expertise. You know, there is a lot of intelligence that has been brought and added to those algorithms to make this work. So let's take some examples of what we were able to achieve out of it. There are 2 graphs. Every color indicates a user, right? There are some 11 colors on this graph. 10 of those were privileged users. 1 of them was a malicious user. The first graph shows on each day, so on the x-axis you have days. Just focus on days 16 and 17. On day 16 and 17, user E accessed more system tables than anybody else, which is fine, right? It could be some different behavior, some different tasks that they had to do. But at the same time, we also saw that user E also had an extremely high amount of failed login attempts on the database on the same days, user 16 and 17. So if we combine the intelligence from both these logics, we are coming to a conclusion that somebody was actually doing a reconnaissance in the environment, tried many failed login attempts, probably eventually succeeded, and then tried to access some tables which usually that user is not able, should not be accessing. The other thing that we do is grouping, And these are some very basic security fundamentals that are evolving in any security operations center, right? Taking an example of a service account abuse. A service account, which should be only be accessing the database from the app server, is being used by a certain number of people. If you see the incidents, the events that are coming to our system will increase because we have seen that multiple users are accessing, using the service account. It's a community, it's a group of people who are using that account all the time. But if we group them by a fact that this particular service account is being shared by multiple people, over the period of time, the number of incidents won't increase. The number of events will increase, but the number of incidents won't increase. And the focus has to be on why this particular service account is being used by so many people. It doesn't matter if it is being used by 10 or 20 people. The moment you block that access or stop that access to the service account, all of your incidents have been closed immediately. So the focus becomes much more clearer when you start grouping incidents. Third thing that we do, and a lot of security vendors are doing this, something which is getting rid of the severity ratings. We still do that, but then there has to be another mechanism to do that. So for example, if we see two cases, a human user accessing 1,05,000 records on a prod environment and just 1 lakh records in a staging environment, right? If you just go by critical, high, medium, this would be in either one of those categories. But if we go with the scoring on the basis of 0 to 100, we can add more intelligence. So let's say we have a baseline score of 70 for anything which is more than, which is excessive data record access. When I say excessive, more than what that user is usually been doing. Then add another 5 points because the number of records that have been accessed is more than 1 lakh. Add another 10 points to the production environment. So the risk score, the incident score for the prod environment incident is now 85, and for the staging is 70, which allows you to focus more. Right? It allows you to focus on prioritize your incidents, what kind of incidents have to be prioritized, and eventually come down to the lower priority incidents as well. So as I said earlier, just to kind of rewind, right? We had the data, we created baseline out of it, detect anomaly, incidents, but most important of it is there has to be a domain expertise involved. Let's talk about what kind of things we identify. This is a case wherein a user was trying to retrieve more than a lakh files from a system. He had legitimate access to that file server. Every time he copied a lot of files. He was just copying 1,000 files every time, and also there was a different, the behavior was slightly different because he was accessing those files outside of working hours or on weekends as well. And that's how we kind of identify, that there was an IP hoarding, intellectual property hoarding is something that is happening in the environment. DBA accessing a database, which he is not supposed to. He has the privilege to access the database, but he is accessing it without the application interface, directly connecting to the application and taking out those data. This is a box and whisker plot. Mathematics people will understand it. I am not a champ on that. But then what it indicates is the color green and the number associated with it. If you see all the different colors, they are the amount of records that different users have retrieved. So the behavior or the number of records that this user has retrieved is more than other users, as well as in comparison to his own behavior also, the number of records that have been retrieved is much, much higher. Account sharing. This is a little complicated. Let me try and my best to kind of explain this. There are two databases, database A and B, and there are different accounts, A, B, C, D, all the way through K. And then you have users. So when I say user, I am user X, but then I can use any account. It could be account 1, 2, 3, any account to access the database. So in this case, we identified that A and B were accessing both the databases, out of time. A and B accessing both the databases, but at the same time, they are sharing their accounts. C and D are accessing account of user B. H is using account of user E and G, and J is using account of G and I. Whatever amount of data I'll throw on you, right? Whatever the best tools that you have, you cannot come to a conclusion like this. This may not on its own point to a breach, to an incident, but definitely to a bad practice that is happening in your environment, which eventually will lead to a breach. Okay. We also do peer group analysis, which is where we integrate with Active Directory, see how are the peers of that particular user behaving. If there is a difference in behavior in terms of on its own behavior and the peer behavior, we highlight that also. I have to rush fast, I'm sorry. The difference, how does the difference look like? This is one of our customers who has been using our auditing solution for years now. Auditing has been compliance driven globally and in India as well, and because of that, they are just covering 2% of the overall databases that they had to. Around a quarter of full-time equivalent working on that particular project, 10,000 alerts a day, and only 1% of those alerts were getting investigated. When they deployed the new platform, what we are talking about, which is Imperva counter breach, they were able to extend the coverage to half of their databases, the same amount of full-time equivalent that is being involved. The 15 to 30 events, not more than that, all of it getting investigated, and there were 2 significant incidents discovered in the matter of 3 weeks of the deployment of this platform. Just to kind of close in now very quickly, the platform, these are some of the screenshots from the platform itself. It allows you to do the investigation directly without you having to put your mind, without you having to go to the DBAs or application and think about what needs to be done with this data. So if you see, we have given a severity rating of high, but then we tell you what influenced this severity. Because the table access had sensitive data, user accessed more data than he is supposed to access. User uses service accounts to access the data, and users never or rarely access those kind of data. Right? So it tells us that why we think that this is a high severity incident and you should focus on it. And it will also tell you what are the typical behaviors and what are the events which has led to conclude that this particular operation was risky in behavior. Okay. This is the last slide, probably a case study. So once we deployed the platform, we deployed in one of the organizations in USA who is more on managing the tolls on the US. Right, and they have data of every car which is passing in the number plates and of every car which is passing through toll numbers. And this data is accessed by FBI by a legislative arrangement so that they can keep a track of criminals and all this kind of stuff. But the access to this data was through an application interface. Now there was this lady who was using an open source client tool to connect to the database and find out where was her ex-boyfriend moving out around the country. And she's not doing any harm, but then when she has access to that kind of data, she can do a lot of different issues also. There are some more use cases. We are always open to discuss those use cases. We have a booth right there, booth number 15. Please, you are almost please welcome to visit us. We'll be happy to talk more. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time left. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rohan. So next I invite Mr. Mookhey, CEO, Network Intelligence. He'll be talking on dataism, singularity, and the future of cybersecurity, an attempt at crystal ball gazing into the future trends for technology, humanity, and implications for cybersecurity. We welcome you, sir, and look forward for your talk.
Hello. Hello. So, good afternoon, everybody. You may not recognize me from the picture over there. So, I basically grew the beard to appear with more gravitas for today's talk, because I'm going to be speaking about what happens in the future, which nobody knows about, but you'll believe me more probably with the beard. So anyway, so today I want to actually talk to you about 3 themes, and I have some notes here because I didn't have time to prepare slides, but the notes are here. So the first theme that I want to touch upon is global trends in general, and then where I believe sort of humanity is going, and then where I believe technology is going. So as you can see, most of this talk has nothing to do with cybersecurity, but let's see how it goes. So before I touch upon the trend of what's happening globally, let me just take a poll. How many of you think that the world is getting better, that we are becoming better as time progresses, and how many of you think that we are getting worse? So how many of you think the world is becoming a better place? Okay, that's a very small number. And how many of you think the world is becoming a worse place? And the rest of you are like, could care less. Okay. But generally you can see that the pessimists are more than the optimists. The news is that the world is actually getting better, surprisingly. Let me tell you why. So for all the parameters that you use to decide whether we are doing better as a human race and as a planet, we are actually doing better on most of those parameters. So life expectancy, we're living longer. Birth rate survival, infants are surviving more. How many births each woman has, how many children per woman, that's actually reducing. So as populations are becoming more educated, as healthcare is becoming better, you don't need to have so many kids because most of your kids will survive. And very few of us today die of diseases that we used to die of, or natural disasters, very few. And also surprisingly, deaths from war and terrorism have reduced. Okay? So what that basically tells you is that all of us are pretty much going to live into our 70s, 80s, and maybe into our 90s as well. Okay, so on all of those parameters, the world is actually doing better. We are living longer, healthier lives. Are they happier lives? I don't know, but that's not the subject for today, some other day. And then there are some gray clouds on the horizon. So for example, I don't know if you closely or carefully looked at Rohan's slide where he showed you the World Economic Forum's global risks. Right above cyber attacks was climate change, the loss of biodiversity, etc. So that is a problem. If we don't address those problems as a human race, we might have bigger things to worry about than GDPR and PCI DSS compliance, right? Because if the world is not livable, who cares about data? Now, I'm coming somewhere with all of this, don't worry, just bear with me, okay? So the next point is, what about the evolution of the human race? Because that has serious implications for how we develop technology, right? So like I said, we are becoming a more peaceful race, actually. There are no great world wars happening. And airplane mode would have made sense. And also one very interesting shift has happened over the last 300, 400, 500 years. So whichever religion, and they say never discuss religion and politics in public or in social circles, but whichever religion you belong to, the world actually has a lot of similarity, whether you believe in Hinduism or Islam or Christianity. The actual religion that we all subscribe to, whether you believe it or not, is called humanism, right? We all believe that humanity is paramount. Whatever helps humans survive is the right decision. Whatever challenges human survival is a problem. And also at a economic level, most of the countries, most of the economies are capitalist, social, liberal structures. So even there, we are moving to platforms that we can agree upon, the way we trade, the way we do business. And so this brings us to the confluence of humanity and technology, where we say, if we can figure out how humans function, then obviously we can try to replicate what humans do. Okay, and most of science now believes that we can break down the human form or the human thought process into what are our biochemical processes. So if I can figure out how you react to a particular situation, then I can replicate who you are in that same situation. Let me give you an example of how this operates in the real world. Suppose you have a choice between two doctors. One is a doctor that you meet personally, you shake hands with them, they look at your data and then they give you a diagnosis. And there's another doctor in a clinic down the road, works the same way, just that you can't see that doctor. He or she sits behind a screen, looks at the same data, gives you a diagnosis, and then you proceed on that prescription. Now, if the second doctor repeatedly gives you better diagnosis, gives you better prescriptions, these things actually fix your problem, who are you going to begin trusting more? Is it the human doctor or the screen? Obviously the machine, correct? And all of us already do this. All of us, whenever you pick up your phone and open up Google Maps, you're trusting the machine more than your panwala to tell you where to go, correct? So more and more, without realizing, we are so dependent on machines taking critical decisions for us. Now, if you add augmented reality to this mix, what it means is that you may not be able to even differentiate between a doctor who's a human and a doctor that's a machine, right? And now this brings us to the third theme, which is this massive shift in technology that we are looking at, right? I'm sure that, you know, if whoever lived in the 20s, 30s, 70s, maybe they all felt that they were in the middle of a revolution, but for sure it seems like we're in the middle of one, right? We're producing exponentially more amounts of data than we know what to do with. I think one of the, Richard was it, said that we are creating and deploying more technology than we know how to actually manage and maintain. And therefore, most of us have this feeling of being sort of left behind, right? I don't know how many of, when I look at Snapchat, I'm like, what the hell? I don't even know how this works, right? And that day I was reading about an app called TikTok, and I'm like, what the hell is that, right? So, and these are the millennials sitting on the front table and giggling because they know what I'm talking about and I don't. And the rest of you are sort of agreeing with me who are not on Snapchat, okay? Also, this technology is getting very personal, by the way, okay? And this is bringing me closer to the cybersecurity aspect of it. I mean, when we speak about a loss of privacy, we are typically talking about the data that our mobiles and apps have about us today. Even the stuff that we do offline, right? You know, most of these apps track, even if you're not logged into the app, they can track what you do. But here's where technology is getting interesting. Now, you've all heard of bionic implants, right? And all of you would agree that if, suppose there is an combatant in the military and he loses a limb in a battle, and there is the option of a bionic implant and they can bionic limb and they can use that bionic limb, they should do so by all means, correct? But now if I flip this question, what if that there is this same soldier, but he's not lost a limb, but he suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, right? And now I have a bionic brain implant, I have a chip which will fix that. Should they go in for that chip? Should that be made legal? Is there a regulatory framework around it? We don't know that yet, right? And similarly, if I have bionic brain implants that can fix my mood, then why don't I go to the other extreme and say, I would like a chip that makes me feel happy all day long. Why not? I like my endorphins rushing all the day long, right? And if these chips are implanted in us, right? Or what if I have a chip that makes me a super smart learner, sort of what we saw in the Matrix, right? That's becoming a reality. What if I can super implant skill sets in a very short amount of time? Should people be allowed to buy that technology? If I can afford it, should I be able to buy that technology? And then you're looking at the creation of actual androids and cyborgs. And all of this is not science fiction. If I spoke about this a year or 2 years back, you'd say, hey, this is crazy, it's not going to happen. This happens in the movies. But this is becoming a reality. These options are becoming real, right? You've heard about the Chinese scientist who genetically modified those 2 babies and made sure that they didn't develop HIV as they grew, right? So how are you going to regulate and control genetic engineering? Now, what does all of this imply for cybersecurity? So that we come to the main point. First, as I said, technology is becoming so personal and so pervasive. With augmented reality, we'll be more and more living in these cocoons. I don't know if you saw this movie from Steven Spielberg, Ready Player One, where all of these people are actually living in this simulated world. Most of their time is spent in this simulated world. In fact, in the US, studies show that millennials and Generation Z are spending most of their time living with their parents and not taking up a job because they don't need to. And so if you don't need to earn for a living and you don't have a job, you know what they're doing most of the day long? Video games and videos. So gaming, if you're in the gaming industry, you're in a great business. If you're in the video creation industry, because that's what we're consuming more and more because it requires the least amount of human interaction. So what this means is there's going to be so much tech and there's going to be so much data that all of this obviously needs to be secured. So if you're in cybersecurity, which most of us are, we're in a great business because we're not going to go out of business anytime soon, right? I mean, with the wave of cloud, we had more opportunities. With the wave of IoT and IIoT and OT security, it's just going to get crazy, right? Imagine having to do cybersecurity for nanorobots, which are going to move through human bodies. I mean, this is medical device security is itself a huge debate topic today, right? So it's only going to get more and more interesting. And so this brings us to an interesting question. Many of the speakers spoke about asset identification. Identify your IT landscape, figure out where your assets are. How do you do that in a hybrid cloud environment with IoT equipment as well in your infrastructure? Is it even going to be feasible as business adapts more and more technology to identify all your endpoints? And having identified your endpoints, are you even going to be practically able to fix and patch those endpoints? Because if that IoT vendor does not support patching, what are you going to do, right? So maybe the thought process is going to change. Another thing that might happen also is that we talk about data as the new oil. Actually, in the Valley, they have a new term. They say data is the new God. So they have a new religion for this called dataism. So they say anything that promotes sharing and analysis of data is a great system. Anything that hinders sharing and analysis of data is a bad decision or a bad technology choice. And so what happens if regulators start to force social media giants that if your moat, if your business beachhead is the data that you own, share that data so that innovation can happen, right? What if a regulator tells Facebook, share this data so that other social media companies can come up with products? What if a financial regulator comes and tells one of the large banks or all of the large banks that put such and such customer data publicly so that more fintech startups can happen because you're holding all of this data and you're restricting innovation, right? In which case, cyber resilience might actually mean my business survives even though I don't care about confidentiality. So the traditional CIA triad, you might just shrug your shoulders and say confidentiality doesn't matter. Can we build businesses like that? That's probably what's going to happen. I mean, look at software companies, right? More and more, even Microsoft are making more and more of their code open source. So the IP, the code itself is no longer my moat. It's no longer my business differentiator, right? And so these are some very interesting trends where the CIA model itself is changing. The final point that I want to talk about is, obviously many speakers have spoken about automation and AI, and I think that's going to have such a massive impact, not just on how we create security solutions, but also on what it does for our jobs. Okay, so let me just throw up a few scary thoughts here. Anybody in vulnerability assessment, you're going to be out of a job. Anybody thinking I'm an ace pen tester and I do red teams, you're going to be out of a job. If VA can be automated, so can pen testing and red teaming be automated. Already it's happening, right? So vulnerability management, vulnerability detection, identification, reporting, I think that's almost automated and that will get even more automated. Security monitoring, first response, already getting automated. Those jobs are going to go away. Phishing detection, the primary means of a breach today is a phishing attack. Most of that will get fixed. More and more people go to Office 365 and G Suite. They're developing more and more advanced algorithms to detect. I mean, they're fantastic at detecting traditional spam. They'll solve the phishing problem before you know it. So more and more we move there. That's also going to be a solved problem. Like I said, we might come up to a stage where the tech landscape is so huge, I might just say, forget about, if you look at the NIST buckets of control, if you look at the NIST categories, you might just say that forget about identify and protect. Let's just focus on detect and remediate, okay? Why bother patching a vulnerability when I can detect it faster and fix it? I won't even bother patching it, right? And so this will lead to the next breed of what we're seeing in the orchestration space. Today, orchestration is a very, very basic, you see very basic playbooks. You see this IOC list come in, added to my firewall blacklist. But remediation technologies will reach a stage where just like that radiologist or that doctor, a CISO will trust a machine to decide things better than the human being. So the machine will decide, or the automated systems will decide which patch to apply, what configuration to change, and what to let it be, because it does not represent a risk. Okay, so today an automated risk decision-making algorithm might actually take better decisions in terms of remediation than otherwise. And finally, what about the role of the CISO? So over here also, many aspects of the CISO's role will get automated. You know, many of the decisions that a CISO takes could actually become done through a smart chatbot. You know, so it might be a little, you know, maybe challenging for CISOs to accept this, but if you have a smart, risk-aware, decision-making smart chatbot, it might actually take the right decisions when the business presents ideas to it. So in conclusion, I think if we solve the larger global issues, which we are not bothered about much, but if we do solve those global issues, technology is going to bring in a lot of exciting ways in which we work, we live, we entertain ourselves, we explore the world and the universe. And obviously one of the central tenets or the pillars on which all of this will run is going to be cybersecurity. So with that, I will end my keynote, and I think I'm out of time as well. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mookhey. And before we start with the last keynote, let's have a quick look at a short video. So for our last keynote, I have with me Mr. Amol Majumdar, Senior Director Technology, Rediffmail Enterprise. He'll be talking on the topic of protect your brand by preventing email spoofing. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you so much. Am I audible? You know, my topic for today is this jargon called DMARC, which has been doing rounds in security conferences across the globe. Rediffmail as an organization hosts around email cloud. We are a cloud hosted email service provider, right? So we host emails of around close to around 25,000 small, medium, and large enterprises in India. Let's look at what DMARC is, what is the whole concept of DMARC, and there are a lot of myths around what DMARC does, what it doesn't do, and what problems will it solve. So I'm here to kind of demystify some of them. We all know email has been, you know, cyber criminals love email to exploit, you know, vulnerabilities, right? So the reason, of course, is email is ubiquitous. Everyone uses email, and email is in everybody's phones and laptops and various kind of devices, even on phones now. Email inherently was never designed for privacy or security in mind. It just grew. You know, the protocol which is used to transfer emails, which is SMTP, just moves emails around the globe. But it was never designed for any kind of, you know, spoof protection, spoof detection, and stuff like that. Cyber criminals have found spoofing to be a proven way to exploit, you know, trust of well-known brands, and they don't really need to hack. Spoofing it can be done by anyone. You know, however, we also have to remember that email in most of the countries is considered a non-repeatable document and can be admitted in the courts. Indian court also admits that. So the Indian IT Act, you know, has admitted email as a non-repeatable document. Now, let's look at what email spoof is. We know about this. You know, everybody's seen that, right? So, an email comes to you from someone which seems to be coming from some bank, okay, to your ID, and gives you some kind of very flashy message saying that your account has been closed, or, you know, you need to enter your password again. And then people fall prey for it. You know, people, you know, when they, for example, they open their email on their phones or something like that, they click on a link, okay, which is a link, phishing link, leads to a site which downloads some kind of malware, and specifically on phones downloads things like apps and APKs, which can then be really disastrous for your device. When somebody gets a spoof email from someone, the company who has not sent it and who the phisher seems to be coming from, causes a lot of complexities for corporates. So let's look at some impacts of phishing. The biggest one, of course, is loss of reputation, right? Negative impact on your brand value and market capitalization, right? So as an example, I think sometime in 2016, this organization called Leone AG, a $1 billion company manufacturing cables for cars, announced that they had fallen prey to a phishing scam. This cost them around $45 million. Besides that, it eroded around $60 million as market value from the stock markets. The second impact of phishing, of course, is loss of intellectual property. It can be trade secrets, it can be costly research data, customer list, formulas, recipes, all that can be compromised by phishing. Not too way back, in October 2018, a leading airline company in Hong Kong fell prey to this fraud of phishing, and it targeted close to around 10 million passengers whose data was hacked. Of course, direct cost is one of the biggest impacts of phishing, where phishing attacks can result in fines levied by regulatory bodies, plus litigation cost and all of that. Now, so what is the solution to all of this? So DMARC as a framework is meant to build trust between the sender and the receiver of emails. So when somebody like a sender adopts a DMARC policy, what he really does is he builds a trust between his email service provider sending emails and hundreds and thousands of email receiving bodies. It might be Gmails of the world, or Microsoft, or even Rediffmail for that matter. So DMARC makes it simple for a sender and receiver to build trust. The other thing it does is it provides visibility to the senders to see what's really happening. Is somebody abusing his brand, somebody sending emails from his domain which they have not really sent? That is what DMARC does. And the most important other thing is the large email service providers, who have to make very complicated and difficult decisions on determining what is spam, what is not. So these choices are really kind of guessworks, and a lot of times these guesswork results in false positives, and which is why some important mails land in junk folders and spam folders. DMARC helps reduce this guesswork. Let's look at what has been done till now to kind of, to fix this whole security problem and trust problem with email. Now, this points which I'm mentioning here, these have been techniques and technologies which have evolved over a period of last now almost 20 years. SPF, and then sender ID, domain keys by Yahoo, and then DKIM, then ADSP again, okay, or visual indicators by service providers, like Google had this Google Gold Key, okay, and then finally DMARC. The winner among them obviously have been SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. So let's look at what they do. So SPF and DKIM have been techniques which have been existing for last now quite some time. What SPF does, it provides an authorization. So for a sender, the sender can declare that I am authorizing only a certain set of IPs to send my email out. So any email coming from any other IP which does not belong to this block is probably a phishing email. What DKIM does is it builds kind of an authentication over this authorization, and it says that the email which I have sent is indeed sent by me. So using DKIM, which stands for domain key identified email, the senders can sign those emails, and the receivers can verify those signatures and say whether the email has been really sent by the person and the fact that it has not been tampered in transit. DMARC as a framework is built over these existing technologies, which is SPF and DKIM. So let's see how DMARC works. So DMARC, to kind of adopt DMARC for brands and senders who send a lot of emails, they need to publish something as the DMARC record in their DNS. So this, of course, helps preventing unauthenticated parties from sending any emails from your domain. And these domains might be the domains which you use to send emails, and plus can be some domains which you have kind of registered, like when you register .com, people generally register .net and .in and those kind of domains also. DMARC also provides kind of reports to senders, and what has really happened when these emails came to me. How many of them really got authenticated? How many of them failed the authentication? And if they failed authentication, why did it fail? You know, was the IP not correct, or was it not signed, and things like that. You know, so consuming DMARC, so when receivers receive emails and the sender has a DMARC record, the receiver is supposed to send a report back to the sender. You know, so these aggregated reports are then analyzed by the senders, and then they can make sense of, you know, things like any phishing happening, or any, have I left out some IP from which I should be sending emails, and stuff like that. So as I said, it builds on SPF and DKIM, and if either of the two or both succeed or are successful, and the fact that the email is aligned, okay, which I'll come to the next slide, then the DMARC is considered to be a success. Otherwise, it is a failure. And then what happens when a DMARC lookup fails is the sender can also decide that, you know, if one of the emails which fails the DMARC check, then the recipient should either quarantine it or reject it or just do nothing. And a lot of companies who adopt DMARC start with a policy, do nothing, because they just want to analyze reports. They want to see what's really happening. Am I missing out on some IP or some email which has not been signed? So what are the steps to enable DMARC for a sender? Of course, number one is enabling this DKIM and SPF on all the domains, including the ones which are defensively registered. As I said, you know, you have a, so for example, when we registered rediff.com, we also registered rediff.net and .in, and then so on, other domains. The next thing that is done is, you know, ensure that all the mailers that you send out, you know, are properly aligned, because generally when, you know, some organization who sends a lot of emails out to its customers, and particularly marketing emails, are sent by contracting some third party like a, you know, email service provider, maybe like a MailChimp or, you know, SendGrid or someone to send those emails out. It's very important to make sure that when emails go out from third parties, you align the sender address with the from address. The sender address is, of course, the address from where the email originates, which is called as the return path in technical terms. That has to be aligned with the from address, because from is the address where everybody sees on in your inbox, right? I mean, it says from whom. After that, you know, a DMARC record has to be published with a policy which says just do nothing, just receive emails and keep sending me reports. The sender is then supposed to analyze those reports and see if there are any gaps. As these reports are analyzed and then these gaps are fixed, then the sender is supposed to change the policy from do nothing to quarantine, and then finally to reject those emails which fail all DMARC authentication. You know, generally if you adopt DMARC and, you know, this DMARC service is provided by a responsible service provider like us, you know, that they would provide you some kind of report, some kind of a dashboard. So it would say how many emails have you sent out in, let's say, the past 7 days, how many of them were quarantined, rejected, and why, what was the reason why they got quarantined or rejected? Did it fail a DMARC SPF verification, or did it fail a DKIM verification? And even if it failed, like for example, a SPF verification would you would probably send a mail from a legitimate IP, but the sender ID, which I said a return path, would probably not be aligned with the from address. That is taken as a failure in DMARC. And of course, some timeline kind of reports when you can see what, so this is kind of your traffic going out, and then gives you a glimpse of what happened with those emails, how many of them failed, how many of them succeeded, and then some service providers who, you know, would provide this kind of interfaces also give you some kind of forensic reports on things like if there are, if somebody is phishing using a domain, you know, along with these reports, forensic reports will also be sent by the receivers, which saying that which is the URL which is being used for phish. So then you can, kind of pursue with your IT team and then take down those URLs and stuff like that. Some detailed reports on things like which IPs are sending bad emails from my domain. Are these IPs really belonging to me, or are these IPs being used by phishers? Besides what DMARC does, which I've kind of tried to explain in short, let's look at what DMARC really doesn't do, and this is kind of myths about email. So about DMARC. So we have occasions where our customers have come to us and said that if I adopt DMARC, will my mail not go into spam? The answer is no. Spam filters don't work only on one decision whether mail passes DMARC or not. Spam filters are very other complicated algorithms on recurring patterns and various other things to decide whether a mail is spam or not. The other thing DMARC does not do is it's not designed to protect your domains which are like, for example, if you have a domain called, if I have a domain called rediff.com, and then if I have a domain called rediff.net and .in, unless DMARC records are published for all those domains, DMARC will not work for them. The other thing DMARC doesn't do is it doesn't work for domains which look like a domain. So if I have a rediff.com, which is rediff.com, and somebody registers reediff.com, DMARC will not work for that. And for that, you need to have, your service provider who hosts your mailbox should have other means of protecting your email, on protecting spear phishing and stuff like that. Of course, that is something which we do for our customers as well. The other thing which DMARC does not protect is, the abuse of display names, and which is one of the biggest reasons for why people get phished, is because they would get an email from some Gmail ID, but a display name would say, for example, let's say State Bank, some department, and that's what is seen in your inbox. So DMARC doesn't protect that. And to protect that, of course, your service provider who's hosting your mailboxes should be offering you some kind of spear phishing protection or privacy protection and stuff like that. Well, that's about it. We are there around to take questions if there are any, and you can shoot us emails on this email ID if you have any questions also. Thank you so much.